Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
This is an email that I received on Tuesday, the 25th of September. It says this. The night finally came. I'd been planning it for several months. I'd done my research, special ordered a large rope, set aside a hopefully lethal combination of pills, and I scouted a location. I printed out letters for friends and family, stapled the pages neatly, left them stacked where they would be found. I was tired of being uncomfortable in my own skin, tired of constantly being called freak or tranny, sick of defending my right to simply just exist, to simply just be myself. I cleaned my cat's litter box, filled his water and food bowls to overflowing. I sent out a group text to everyone who might care, confident they wouldn't see it till morning. Just before walking out of my apartment, I hugged my cat and burst into racking sobs. I recall my emotions by then were very erratic. I would be calm and cool one moment, sad the next, and even ridiculously happy at times. I made my way to the top of the building I'd chosen. I tied a noose, like I had studied from YouTube videos. I'd studied suicide success statistics and found that without a gun, a proper noose was my best chance. Once secured at the edge of the building, ready to go, I enacted my backup plan and swallowed a few bottles of pills. Neck snap, suffocation, plummet to the sidewalk, or overdose. I had no intention of failing. I waited at the edge a few moments until I started feeling groggy and high. The timing of everything was essential. It felt particularly selfish to kill myself and not donate my organs to others who might need them more. As such, part of my plan was to call 911 once I was reasonably certain it would be too late for them to stop me. Everything was in place, so I called them and then set my phone aside without bothering to speak to the dispatcher beyond simply saying, "I'm about to die. I'm an organ donor." I moved as close to the ledge as I could, psyching myself up for the final moment. Turns out jumping off a building is no easy feat. In fact, it's terrifying. Given my objective, you might think it would be the least of my concerns, but it wasn't. I knew myself well enough to know the height would be a problem. But I felt eventually the sleeping pills would knock me out and I could simply sort of slip off. Balanced precariously as I was, even a bit of a breeze would have been enough. It's then that I became overwhelmed with fear of hell. As an atheist of many years, I thought I'd left such things behind me long ago. Stranger, too, the particular faith I was raised in, Jehovah's Witnesses, didn't even believe in hell. But still, there and then, facing that unknown final threshold, all the stories I'd accumulated over a lifetime began running through my mind. Satanic hell, Hades, Nephilim, whatever. I surprised myself by actually praying. I asked God to forgive me, to take mercy. Later, I would look back on this moment with confusion. Indeed, it still puzzles me. I don't know quite what to make of it. I suppose the myth of hell is just a pernicious idea, like a virus I didn't know I'd caught. I shouldn't have survived the night. I barely remember the police trying to talk me down off the ledge. I remember being very annoyed, feeling like I just needed to sleep. I remember yelling at them to leave me alone and just let me sleep. And then I remember being walked into the hospital I remember putting on a hospital gown and lying down, and then waking up the next day. My friends there, angry, scared to death, lost, desperately trying to hide it from me. I'm very grateful to all of them for rallying around me then. What would I have even done without their support? I tried to talk to them beforehand, but they never seemed to understand why I was so depressed. Those who were religious were by far the least helpful. They just kept insisting I needed God to be happy, as if Christians hadn't been making me miserable my entire life. The others were more helpful, but they didn't know what to say or do either. I needed professional help desperately. If there is anything to be taken from my story, any lesson to be gleaned, it's the abysmal state of mental health care in our country. Despite having good insurance, I was never able to find a shrink. I called several helplines and nobody was available. I went to a medical doctor who gave me some pills, but never followed up with a list of psychiatrists she promised. I tried going through my insurance and found it to be a bureaucratic nightmare. I found a local community resource and got on a list. They actually called me about a month before my attempt. They finally had space, but by then I had already given up. It was too late. After the hospital, once I was physically recovered, I spent some time in a mental ward on suicide watch. At one point, my friends became very irritated with me. I was barely getting out of bed, and they felt I needed to be applying myself to getting better. Taking advantage of the hospital to get help, they wanted me to speak with doctors. I took them over to the schedule on the wall where all the group activities were listed. One after another were faith-based. There was no option at all to spend time with a doctor. I asked them which one they wanted me to attend. I was grateful that after this they redoubled their efforts to get me out of there and back home. Talking about the hospital, she said, "It's ironic, it was the nicest one in the state. Several of my fellow patients assured me this was the case, having been in several. Apparently, having staff that was only indifferent to our suffering was the best the state had to offer. They told me all the horror stories of the other hospitals around, of abuse and cruelty. They let me know in no uncertain terms I was very lucky to be in the good hospital. Even today, it's still hard to get treatment. I spent the last year with a wonderful counselor I met through Planned Parenthood. Unfortunately, I had to move 2 months ago to another county. Now the old county says they can't help me anymore. I need the new county, but the new county says they don't have the paperwork. Call the other government office. I get bounced around all the time. And as of now, I still have nobody to talk to. I've come to the conclusion that society needs to change its approach to mental health care. If you're all unwilling to put in the extra resources it would require, at least let people like me die in peace. If you keep insisting that we not kill ourselves and get better, then you have to offer better. Help us or let us go. It's all I ask." "I'm sorry I can't be more upbeat," she said. "We've all heard the survivors who find the new lease on life, who counsel suicidal people to hang in there, who tell us it gets better. Maybe that will be me someday, but I'm still recovering. I'm not particularly happy to still be here." What you are hearing today on this broadcast is a series of perspectives on a subject so sensitive, I'll admit to being nervous. Nervous about making a verbal misstep or misusing a term or making some kind of a mistake in my approach to suicide that might cheat the subject. So right here at the very beginning of the broadcast, I just want you to know that any inadvertently clumsy language on my part is not intended. The opinions and the questions that I offer up are in good faith, and they're rooted really in a genuine desire to approach these issues of life and death with the respect that they deserve. I'm learning about this subject more every day, just like you are. And just like you, I want to talk about these difficult subjects with the goal of trying to make things better instead of worse, knowing more tomorrow than I knew yesterday. And perhaps along the way, encouraging anybody out there listening considering suicide because of depression or some kind of life difficulty or whatever to continue to reach out for answers, to find some connection, to find and discover an empathetic ear, and perhaps discover some resources that we're going to provide here that might help them get out of the valley. Okay, we're going to talk about the abrupt taking of one's own life due to things like mental illness or personal hardship or whatever. We're going to talk about end-of-life issues for people who are in chronic pain. They're in the clutches of a terminal illness, and they say, I want to take my own life. I want to check out on my terms. We're going to share personal stories of many people in the audience who have written and will call. And honestly, I had so much input, so many amazing responses to this discussion, people eagerly wanting to be a part of the solution, to lend some perspective. There's no way I can cover all of it here, but thank you to everybody who submitted. And we're going to talk about all this stuff, rejecting any notions of an afterlife, heaven or hell, gods or devils, angels or demons whispering in our ears, influencing us to do this or to do that. The myth of a purposeless and joyless atheist existence on this planet, and the lie that the church and the church's dogma are the only true providers of help for the hopeless. The idea that only the church can help solve these problems, only the church can provide the answers, we reject that right off the bat. Included in the description box of the broadcast will be linked resources for anybody who needs to find out more, discover more on the subject of suicide. Going to talk to a mental health professional, psychotherapist, Dr. Steven Davidson, who's going to share his perspective as a psychotherapist. The emails submitted for the broadcast are so personal that I've decided I'm just going to use the first initial of their first names. I've got an email from Jay in North Carolina. Jay said, I was raised Catholic. My parents signed me up to be an altar boy at our church, where I served for 6 years before going on to co-found our local youth group. The more senior heads of the group often tapped me to give talks on a variety of topics, since, being just a few years older than our members, I could connect with them in ways that the other leaders could not. Most were just fluff, what it means to be a good Catholic, or how to deal with common social issues, stuff like that. But when a teenage Catholic boy in the next town killed himself, I was asked if I could address the group the following day. I took it as a sign from God, an opportunity to give my life meaning. If I could help someone, prevent someone from hurting themselves, then perhaps my own pain would have been worth it. You see, when they asked if I could give a talk on depression, they didn't know I was wearing bloody bandages beneath the sleeve on my left wrist. No one knew what I'd been going through, or about the multiple attempts to end my own life. But they found out that weekend. I could see kids who were hurting, and I thought the best way to help was to show them they weren't alone. So I told them what I'd done, and how I struggled, and how I was desperately trying to get better. I gave the talk again at another youth group in a different town, then another, and another. Every few months I was giving the talk to a group of teens, and every few months I was asking my priest how to get better. I was asking why I was suffering. I was asking how I could continue living when I only looked forward to the end. The emptiness of the answers matched the emptiness I felt. It's just a test. It'll pass. Have faith. Be patient. Trust in Jesus. Pray. All the while I was giving talks and trying to help kids I had no business helping, trying to fix problems when I didn't even understand my own, relying solely on the idea that if I could save just one person, then it would all be worth it. I got no help from the church, only platitudes. Several years later, after a long conversation with a friend from the youth group, I was lying in bed trying to understand my purpose. I still held on to the belief that I could use my experience to help others, that one day I'd encounter someone who needed help and I'd be there to give it. The silver lining of my own dark cloud would light their way. It had to. If this was all part of a plan, then it had to. And while I was thinking about that, my friend, whom I had just spoken with a few hours before, was hanging by his neck. The moment had come, my opportunity to use 5 years of suffering to help someone to fulfill God's plan for me, and I'd failed to see it. If there'd been some outward sign hinting at his pain and desperation, it was too subtle for me to see. What good was this gift if I couldn't use it when it mattered most? It was as if there was no divine plan, no purpose. My depression wasn't some preparation for me to prevent his suicide. Either it had all been arranged by an evil deity who took pleasure in tormenting humanity, or it was all meaningless. I saw too much good in the world to believe this was all created by a Near Eastern volcano demon named Yahweh. But there was also too much evil for me to believe it was all part of some benevolent plan. The Catholic Church failed me when I needed help the most. The priest told me that earthly suffering was punishment for my own sins, piling Catholic guilt on top of my own self-loathing, suggesting I confess my sinful suicide attempts without ever acknowledging them as the product of a disease. They encourage me to help others without ever suggesting I get help myself. Not long after my friend's death, I left the church, and while searching for answers in the Bible, I found instead a fascinating collection of contradictory myths and legends which destroyed my belief in deities completely. After 19 years, I still suffer from depression. But it's been over a decade since my last suicide attempt. I no longer try to solve other people's problems. There are qualified professionals for that. But some silver lining did eventually frame that dark cloud. I found another way to help others. As an atheist, I started a podcast that shines a light on the mythological origins of my favorite book, the Bible. Jay, with absolute honesty, I'd like to say that I think your letter actually will help some people. You are helping someone. The National Institute of Mental Health has a lot of information about suicide, defined as when people direct violence at themselves with the intent to end their lives, and they die because of their actions. They say it's best to avoid using terms like committing suicide or a successful suicide when referring to death by suicide, as those terms often carry negative connotations. People commit atrocities, they commit murder. Adding the word commit to suicide sometimes carries a stigma. The Centers for Disease Control released statistics a couple of years ago on the leading causes of death. Suicide came in as the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. Now, I don't have global statistics, so these by necessity will focus on the United States. The 10th leading cause of death, suicide. That's almost 45,000 people. That's more than twice as many who die in this country by homicide. 1 every 12 minutes. That means in the first hour of this broadcast, 5 people will have ended their lives by suicide. Over 22,000 of the annual deaths by firearm, over 11,000 by hanging or another form of suffocation, over 6,000 by poison. The percentage of suicide jumps in younger people ages 10 to 34, where it was the second leading cause of death. Suicide rates highest in women, ages 45 to 54, and in men over 65. The 2016 National Survey on Drug Use and Health revealed that 4% of adults ages 18 and older in the U.S. had at some time thoughts of suicide. It's most common in the 18 to 25 age range to have these thoughts. It's highest in those who are multiracial. Religions have long had and proclaimed their positions on the subject of suicide. 6th century Christianity saw suicide as a secular crime. It was a sin against God. This claim echoed by none other than Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. In the 1500s, those who died by suicide weren't even allowed to have a Christian burial. Suicide and attempted suicide punished by excommunication from the church. And they enacted laws, civil and criminal laws, to discourage suicide. Don't take your own life, or you will be interred in an unconventional way, possibly contrary to your religion. And on top of that, your property and possessions will be confiscated, perhaps even the property and possessions of your family. Islam, like Christianity and Judaism, did not and largely doesn't see suicide as a mortal sin, condemning your soul as well as the body, eternal damnation. The Catholic Church, however, says suicide contradicts the natural inclination of the human being to preserve and perpetuate his life. It is gravely contrary to the just love of self. It likewise offends love of neighbor because it unjustly breaks the ties of solidarity with family, nation, and other human societies to which we continue to have obligations. Suicide is contrary to love for the living God. Suicide is seriously contrary to justice, hope, and charity. It is forbidden by the fifth commandment. Now, the Catholic Church's official stance does allow for those who might not be of right mind, meaning that they are less responsible morally for suicide. The Catechism of the Catholic Church talks about psychological disturbances, anguish, or grave fear of hardship, suffering, torture. Apart from that, it is widely accepted in the Catholic Church that those who die by suicide cannot and will not enter heaven. I have Courtney on the switchboard. Courtney, you're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Thanks for being a part of the conversation. Kind of a tough subject today. What's your perspective or experience?
Thanks for having me, Seth. First, I just want to thank you for everything you do. I know everybody who calls in probably wants to do that, so I wanted to get that in real quick.
Very kind, thanks.
My perspective is my sister killed herself quite a while ago, and after that, I kind of got this calling, if you'll forgive the term, to do something about that. So I got trained up as a suicide crisis counselor, and that's what I do currently.
Tell me about that. You are trying to build something out of the ashes. I don't want to be too dramatic about it, but I mean,
sure.
Let's take this horrible situation and turn it around and do something good with it? Or?
Well, I'm not so sure as much as it is that, as much as it's an entirely preventable thing. And I felt very powerless at the time. And I think a lot of people who are touched by suicide feel that way. And it doesn't have to be that way. So, I mean, I got the training and I decided, I wanted to be part of a solution, but I also wanted to understand how we can, better help people in that hot moment of crisis.
Well, tell me about you today versus you back then. How might you have counseled yourself? What were you doing then that you sort of regret or see differently today?
You know what? There's a lot of stuff that I say to people who are in the situation that I was in, and you'd actually be surprised. A lot of our callers are people who have been touched by suicide and are just racked with guilt because they couldn't do anything. And then I guess what I would say is you can certainly educate yourself as to what can be done, and there's lots of programs out there. I can email you a few that you can add to your show notes. There's a lot of stuff you can educate yourself and be ready for, but the thing I hear most often from callers is that they don't feel heard by people they reach out to. And it's usually because, if we were good friends and I was saying to you, Seth, I'm feeling really depressed, I'm feeling like I want my life to end, and I keep doing that, you're probably going to clam up and you don't know what to say. And so what I would counsel anyone in that moment is you need to, first off, hear that person. They really, really want to be heard, and just tell them, look, I really understand what you're saying. I hear what you're saying to me. And then just be honest about your lack of capability. Just say, I really don't know what the best way to help you is, instead of clamming up, because they really want to feel heard. And when people clam up, it causes them to feel as if it just perpetuates that image they have in their head of not mattering or that no one cares.
Courtney, can I ask you about your sister? Do you talk about this?
Yeah, sure.
Were there warning signs in retrospect? Were there things you're like, now that I know, I would have seen this differently? Did that happen with you?
No. So unfortunately, I never got any signs. Now, I can't speak to whether or not anyone else in her circle did, but I certainly did not. As a matter of fact, the day she did it, she had called me that day and we chatted about just inconsequential stuff and the new car she had just gotten, that kind of thing. And I remember when I found out she did it, I was with my then boyfriend at the time, and he looked at me and he said, "We just talked to her." And there was truly nothing that I could have seen at that time. And that's not terribly uncommon, which is why I would encourage people that if somebody does say something or reach out to you, it's really important that you don't ignore that and you capitalize on it, because you may be the only person they're saying that to.
You blame yourself at any time? Did you take that on your shoulders?
No, but the rest of my family did. My mom did quite a bit. She felt like she should have seen something, or there was something she could have said or done, and then she spent a long time in a massive search for why. And the reality of the situation that I've come to realize, the reason people commit suicide is entirely the same thing. What causes them to get to this point is different, but the reason they kill themselves is because they feel that the pain of being alive is more than the pain of dying. And if you're trying to hunt for why they got to that point, it's kind of a pointless endeavor. The real thing you need to focus on is telling them that that's not necessarily true.
What's it like being on the phone with someone who's right there? I mean, do you feel a responsibility of sort of walking them back off the ledge?
At first, it was incredibly stressful. I did a lot of training, and you have people and resources you can lean on right there with you. As you get better at it, they are less, I wouldn't say less available to you, but they are less in the forefront. You don't need them as much. But it was terrifying the first couple of calls. When I take a call, my goal isn't to save their life per se. My goal is to take them from a very hot moment where their focus is narrow. It's almost like a drinking straw. Their focus is incredibly narrow, this drinking straw. And all I really want to do is widen out that straw so we get to like a swimming pool and they can see everything. It's really not my place or your place or anyone's place to tell somebody what they can and can't do with their property, and their life, I believe, is their property. But it's my job, and what I feel my job is to make sure that they're out of that hot moment and into a very cool moment where they can see the entire picture. And that usually helps. I mean, it's usually quite a big thing. Most calls end with that person thanking me and being much calmer.
How does a conversation like that end? Because if they were in that, and I like the term hot moment, right? Everything's escalated. Everything's coming at them at 1,000 miles an hour. What happens next?
Well, so we have a bunch of resources that we can give out depending on why you were in that hot moment. So sometimes you're in that hot moment because you're facing homelessness or because you're facing domestic abuse or that kind of thing. And we can give resources for that. But the real short answer is once they get off that phone, I don't really know what happens to them. I mean, sometimes we get repeat callers and we can tell whether or not they're repeat callers. We don't get a lot of information because it's a privacy thing, but we can tell. But I mean, you'll almost never hear from that same person again, and you'll never really know. And that can sometimes be pretty hard to deal with, especially if they hang up on you. It's so gut-wrenching when that happens because you're left not knowing what happened.
Let's talk about how religion handles these life and death subjects, specifically the quote-unquote taboo subject of suicide. In the Catholic Church, it's a mortal sin. Have you had experience with the religious approach to suicide, and what are your thoughts?
Sadly, more often than I would care to, a large number of callers, Seth, are calling in because of religious guilt or feelings that without a religious context would just be normal things you would probably brush off. And interestingly enough, that doesn't really, the fact that suicide is a mortal sin, I mean, that might actually be helpful in the sense that might have gotten them to call in. But I've gotten a lot of callers where the rationale for why they're feeling suicidal is some sort of religiously motivated rationale where they've committed some horrible sin and they're going to go to hell for the rest of their life. And I don't mean to make light of it, but whenever they say things like that, I think to myself, well, if you're going to go to hell for the rest of your life, isn't that more reason to stay alive on Earth as long as possible? But obviously I don't say that, but the thought crosses my mind. But yes, no, it's religious intervention happens a lot, and it frustrates me quite a bit as an atheist. It's more like I said to you in the very beginning about my sister's suicide. It's preventable. And as an atheist, feeling life-ending guilt over some sort of perceived slight against a make-believe deity is completely preventable, and it frustrates me to no end.
Religion poisons everything.
I would agree, my friend.
I know. I mean, statistically, there must be someone who's listening right now who has at some recent time been there. I mean, what would you say to somebody who was listening on the other side of the podcast at this moment?
I would say, first off, you're absolutely not alone. This is a thought that every human being has at one point of their life or another. We call it the big secret that everyone is keeping from everyone else. Every human being at some point in their life, and if you haven't yet, you will, has considered ending their own life. It's you're not alone, and you're not crazy for thinking it. There's places for you to go. There's the National Suicide Hotline, and then there's also if you're not able to speak to someone, which is very common, you can actually get this kind of counseling or intervention now through a text message. So if you text 741-741, you can get this kind of assistance via a text message where you don't have to speak to someone. Sometimes it's too hard to get the words out, but you can text it in. It's a common thing, and people do care.
I'm going to put those links in the description box and make sure they are easily accessible to anybody who might need them. Courtney, thanks for sharing your perspective. Thanks for your good work. You are providing, solutions, conversations. Your connection with other people might just be saving their lives. And I say that without hyperbole. You're making a difference, and it's an honor to be able to talk to you.
Oh, I appreciate that. The honor's all on this side of the call, Seth.
If you will allow me, we're going to take a real short break and then come back to continue these conversations. I've got Yvette D'Entremont on the line. It's interesting, she's known as this sort of sarcastic, funny, buoyant person. But because of some health issues and life stuff, she told me in advance of this show that she had been there, sort of on that precipice, actually entertaining the idea of suicide in regard to herself. And she wanted to come and sort of share just a quick snapshot of her own journey, which many of you might be able to relate to. So I'm going to speak with her, more of your calls and emails. And then I've got Dr. Steven Davidson, a psychotherapist, to talk about suicide from the perspective of a mental health expert. Lots to do, my friends. Hang on. Much of what you and I are talking about today relates to emotion, right? Rooted in the processes of our brains. And there are reasons for how and why we as human beings receive and perceive things, and how it all comes back to the machine of the mind. And I honestly cannot ever remember seeing a better encapsulation of how our brains work than the Great Courses lecture. It's done by neuroscientist Dr. Jeanette Norden from the Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. She does such a good job of sort of parceling everything out. The lecture is essentially themed chapters. Each one has a different angle on something critical that the brains do. The running of the central nervous system and hearing, vision, touch, expression, language, diseases of the brain like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, the feelings we experience, joy, despair, everything in between, and how those impact us beyond the brain. I mean, the lecture on depression alone is just a fascinating 30 minutes. Types of depression and how it's treated. Brain science designed for non-PhD types like you and me. The Great Courses Plus is awesome. It has thousands of videos across so many different subjects: medicine, history, cosmology, evolutionary biology, cooking, travel. There's even a course on great and classic films. Watch anytime, anywhere, or listen along with the Great Courses app. I know you're going to love it. And as one of my listeners, you can enjoy any of their lectures for free with your free trial using my special URL. So sign up right now at thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. My patrons get a commercial-free broadcast. They get the show early every single week, and they are cherished supporters of me and this broadcast. If you would like to become a patron, just log on and check out the options at patreon.com/Seth Andrews. Back to the switchboard. If I may, I can use your full name, but I've been going by first initials. Which do you prefer?
Oh, you can say Nancy. We'll use first name.
What is your perspective? What would you like to talk about?
A couple of things, just a little bit about my story. My father suicided a little over a year ago, and I know so many times for the family members, there's this intense guilt of, I should have stopped it, and we can't. In fact, I'm a mental health practitioner. I went to the psychiatrist appointments with my father. He said he was fine. I even challenged him in those sessions. And even with all that, I couldn't stop it. He didn't let us know that that's what he was thinking. He purposely didn't. And so that's one of the pieces. When somebody decides, we don't get to stop it. But that's one of the huge pieces of guilt.
May I ask how old he was when he took his life?
He was 80. What happened is about 4 years prior to that, he had developed a delusional disorder, and he thought his wife had an affair, which she did not. In the elderly, they can't give him antipsychotics, and the only thing they could really give him is anti-anxiety, and he wouldn't take those. So, and the delusions just got bigger and bigger.
As a mental health professional, can you speak beyond your own personal experience? Are there things that we often miss or people really need to know but usually don't?
I would say a couple of things is if somebody says they're suicidal, call the police. That's always my thing is if somebody says it, they're going to the hospital. Or bring them to a mental health practitioner. I've got an assessment piece that I do where I can look at whether they need the hospital or not. The things that we look for are, do they have a plan? Do they have access to the plan? And is the plan lethal? The 8-year-old girl who told me that she was going to call 911, steal a police officer's gun, and shoot her, who had never seen a gun, I had less worries about. The 16-year-old male who hunts and has guns and is suicidal, and his plan is to shoot himself, that's a straight to the hospital. So those are the pieces that we really look at.
It's hard for those of us on the outside to know what to say. Like my first instinct, Nancy, is to say, well, I'm very sorry about your father, but it just seems so, so inadequate. I'm sure that's common, right?
It is. I understand when people say that there's not much else that they can say. They can't fix it. Just to know that people care is often wonderful. And as an atheist, of course, we get a fair amount of, God's plan, or we're praying for you. Now, my father was an atheist, so sometimes that was a tough piece to be like, oof, keep God out of it.
People came to you with Godspeak. This is all part of the grand design, or he's in a better place.
He's in a better place was probably a big one. Because the funeral was very secular, I think that kept more people quiet. We had Johnny Cash music. We actually had a minister who was a family friend do the service, and she was wonderful because we went and we talked to her and we said, no religion, no anything. And she was first like, I don't know how to do that. And I was like, replace Johnny Cash songs for hymns, replace readings for gospel. And So I sent her a couple of links, and she did a wonderful job.
You may have expanded her horizons, right?
I think so. Yeah, because she was just kind of shocked. Like, I'm a minister. You want me to do it this way?
Probably one of the most challenging things about doing this particular broadcast is I have this desire, this naive desire to like say, here's the answer. Look, we found it. Go take this and this will solve everything. But these life and death issues don't work like that, do they?
No, they don't. The best thing is community and being with people who you love and care about. And that's what helps you get through it.
You're awesome, Nancy. Thanks so much for lending your voice to this conversation.
Well, thank you very much.
I want to welcome Yvette D'Entremont to the show. Yvette, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Seth.
Normally, when we talk, it's sort of raucous. It's these, whether we're poking fun at David Avocado Wolf or the Food Babe or,
I'm telling dick jokes normally.
Yeah, now you're doing the porn cast, but here we are talking about the very serious subject of suicide. And
that's what I'm on for today? Shit. I'm kidding. I'm sorry. I can't not tell a joke. I'm sorry.
Is this how you cope with these heavy subjects? Is humor?
Because
is it a deflection? Is that what it is?
I think if I didn't use humor, I would be lost. Different people cope different ways. You can't tell someone how to cope with something like depression. And I haven't talked about it a lot publicly because I think that there is some amount of, you're supposed to be the sad girl. I'm like, I am. That's why I use humor. This is kind of how I cope.
So whenever you were sort of put on my radar as someone to participate, have you ever had those thoughts? Like, if every day felt like this, I'd just as soon pull the plug. I mean, you share as much as you're comfortable with, but you tell me.
The best way to describe it is I don't know if I was ever in a position where I would have killed myself, but I was in very dark places where I did think about the eventuality of suicide or the thought that life wasn't worth living. I'd gotten very nihilistic. And this has happened, I would say, twice in my life to a point where I should have been talking to a professional and either didn't have the means to or just wasn't ready to mentally, didn't have that in me. Once was when my headaches first started. When you're looking at a life of constant pain and it doesn't look like there's any help in sight or any end to it. I don't think I was what someone would call classically depressed with suicidal ideation, but the saddest conversation I had in my life was telling my mom, I'll put up with this for 3 years. I'll keep looking for answers. I'll keep looking for a way to manage my pain for 3 years. That's what I'll give it because I can't look forward to the next 60 years of my life in this much pain every day. And luckily, we found something that worked in about a year, but that was, the first time in my life where that was a serious consideration. And it was strange because it was not, a depressive episode. And then last fall, I had a truly deeply depressive episode. This is strange to open up about. I wouldn't keep, razors in the bathtub. It was pretty bleak moment to moment. And, there were times when I could be, on a podcast being laughy and funny. And, people ever so often you'll see someone talking about someone who's committed suicide and they'll have a picture of them from the day before and they're smiling and they're happy and they're like, no one could have seen it coming. It's like, well, you're not crying constantly when you're depressed. You're crying for 2 hours at home after you took that picture, but you're not constantly down. You're trying to do things to pick yourself up. And God, did I try? I mean, I did everything in my power to try to get myself to be okay. Like last fall, I fought being on antidepressants. I went on 2 antidepressants, and I'm still on them, and it's made a huge difference. I went to therapy. I did all the things I had to. But I just got to the point where I just got so nihilistic and I was like, life is meaningless. There's no point to any of this. This horrible shithole is all life is going to be. And to give people a sense of what happened, my husband and I, at the time he was my boyfriend, and my husband and I had moved to the San Francisco area for a job for him. And within the course of about 6 weeks, before we'd moved up there, I had collapsed from exhaustion. When I say collapse, I don't mean got tired and went to bed very quickly in my room. I mean in my kitchen from my standing position, fell and collapsed the night before a manuscript was due. I had had the air let out of my tires multiple times, and this was after an article had come out that I'd gotten some death threats for. The day after he moved, we figured out the company that he moved up there for a job for was going under because the person who ran it was in a car accident so bad that he had 3 major brain bleeds. Like, things are backing
Big life
up.
stuff. Yeah, I get that. Sure.
Don't worry, it's still coming. A few weeks, not long after we moved, I had a miscarriage. I wasn't trying to have a baby. I found out that I was pregnant via having a miscarriage. The hormones threw me into a tailspin for another bunch of months. But I mean, all that happening, I moved away from my support system, from all my friends. Moving wiped out my savings, and the person that we'd moved up for Derek to work for was withholding a good month and a half of pay. When I told people after last fall that I was depressed, that I was going through hell, so many people said to me, I had no idea. And it might have been that these were some online friends, and I'm pretty good at holding it together online. But it was interesting that people didn't know.
We're going to continue this very serious subject. Are you doing okay these days? I mean, I know that, on the surface, you're expected to say, yes, I'm great. But I mean, are you all right?
In general, I'm doing pretty well. I mean, everyone gets a little blue, and I am no exception. I have my ups and my downs, but it has been many, many months since I have been staring at the wall crying. Like, the worst thing to handle is the anxiety, and that kind of goes up and down with the weather. But all of it's better controlled than it was, I'd say, at any point in my life. And it's because, like, everything had to get really bad before I could see that there was always kind of an underlying level of depression, anxiety. So I have the tools to cope with it better now. So that's where we're at now.
All right. Well, for what it's worth, the people don't just love your work. They love you. I mean, they just love you. They take you personally, and I count myself among them. So thanks for talking to us on a sensitive issue and sort of sharing such a personal story. You sure you're okay with sharing that? I mean, what happens if David Avocado Wolf gets a hold of this and he's like, look, we knew she was far from perfect. And these people going to use this against you? Do you worry about that at all? Or
do people think I don't know I'm not perfect? Like, I have my mother.
I just don't want them kicking it in your face, is all I'm saying.
I have my mother to remind me that I'm not perfect, okay? Like, I can't even train my dog to stop shitting on the carpet. Like, there are regular reminders, smelly ones, that I am not a perfect human. So it's and the other thing is, if somebody wants to use it against me that I'm depressed, I think that just kind of makes them the asshole.
Totally.
So.
All right. Well, you give Derek and Buddy a scratch behind the ears for us. And
I'll send the scratch behind Derek's ears directly from you, Seth.
Okay, you do that. And it's always a pleasure, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon. In the meantime, you take care of yourself, okay?
Thank you. Take care, Seth.
Had an email here from John. John will mind me using his name for this one. I used to be a born-again Christian. I tell people now that it was a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. In the 80s, I was working on a Master of Divinity degree. I have a BA in philosophy. I was in a pastoral counseling class. One day, a Methodist lay preacher related an incident. A member of one of his churches called him. She said that her husband was in the backyard with a gun to his head and threatening to kill himself. The preacher went right over and confronted the man. God hates suicide, and if you kill yourself, you'll go to hell. The man put his gun down. The professor, an ordained Mennonite, turned to look at me. He knew I'd have something to say. I said, "You were lucky. The other outcome could have been the man thinking God doesn't care about me either, and bam." I had a message from Dorothy. She said, "Big fan up here in Canada. I've listened to every single one of your podcasts from the beginning. You were talking about your upcoming show on suicide. You mentioned assisted suicide for terminally ill patients. This has been legal in Canada for over 2 years now, and I would love to offer some perspective on it. I'm a member of Dying with Dignity Canada, and I've been following the issue since well before it became legal. First, and probably most importantly, we no longer refer to this as suicide, meaning dying with dignity. The term suicide is associated with depression or other mental illness, which is often treatable and or temporary, and certainly not grounds to receive assistance to die. If your best friend flunks an exam and says he wants to kill himself and you provide him with a gun, that would be assisting a suicide. And that's still a criminal offense in Canada, and she says it should be. Another reason not to call this suicide is that the people who request it don't actually want to die, they want to live. But they know they are dying, and they want help to die comfortably and on their own terms. We don't call this procedure physician-assisted dying, since it's not always carried out by physicians. Sometimes it's a nurse practitioner. What we have legalized is medical assistance in dying, or MAID, as it's commonly known now. It's been legal since June 2016, and last I checked, over 3,700 Canadians have received an assisted death. It's now considered a medical procedure and is covered by our healthcare system. And as it catches on and becomes better known, it's increasing. About 1% of deaths nationwide, I think. The criteria for MAID or MAID are that one must be legal age and eligible for Canadian health care, no medical tourism, have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, and that's not necessarily imminently terminal, make a voluntary request, and be able to provide informed consent, meaning that you're mentally competent. Advance request for MAID, like if I get Alzheimer's someday and no longer recognize my family, those are not currently legal, but that's being challenged. The majority of Canadians are okay with MAID and actually supportive. The opposition, you guessed it, is religion, and it's causing the same sorts of problems you see in the U.S. when religious boards are controlling healthcare institutions. In Canada, the funding is public, but there are some facilities that were allowed to keep their historical religious affiliation, even after the change to a publicly funded system, like, 50 or 60 years ago now? And this is causing plenty of uproar, and religion is having to gradually back down to public demand and outcry. As it becomes widely known, a lot of the original opposition's fading. Most palliative care nurses and physicians were strongly opposed at the start, thinking that patients would be pressured to just die already. But that's not happening. Most people receive palliative care while considering MAID if they want or need it, and, very importantly, few requests for MAID are based on physical pain. In fact, if someone asks for MAID because of pain, their application will likely be rejected, and the patient referred back for better pain control. Of course, they may later reapply and then be approved, but basically, if someone's primary complaint is physical pain, that's viewed as a failure of medicine rather than a reason to die. Most pain can be controlled. If, after everything has been tried, the pain really cannot be controlled, then the patient would be eligible for MAID. The number one reason people request MAID is control, autonomy. Usually people who want it are strong-minded, self-directed people who value dignity and quality of life over quantity, and they want to go out on their own terms at a time of their choosing rather than wait for the worst or face some long, lingering death. No amount of palliative care or analgesia compensates for the desire for control and dignity. It's the reason I would want it. How about you? The other thing that's really different here in Canada, Dorothy says, compared to U.S. states like Oregon, which have legalized assisted dying, is that here the procedure is performed by a doctor, or occasionally nurse practitioner, by IV, similar to when a vet puts an animal to sleep, rather than the patient taking oral medication. Of the thousands of MAID deaths that have taken place since legalization, only about 5 or so used oral medication. The reason is that the oral route is iffy if the patient's not able to swallow the whole dose, and it's a lot, or they throw it up. Either of those could occur because, let's face it, the patient's already sick. Then death may not occur, and the patient may end up in agony and worse off. Some patients can't take anything orally due to nausea and swallowing problems. Some are not physically capable of lifting a glass to their mouth. The way it works where I live is 2 separate teams of nurse, doctor, social worker conduct assessments of eligibility, and both teams must approve the request. Then there's a 10-day waiting period, which could be shortened if circumstances warrant. And then if the patient wants to go ahead, and not everyone does, an appointment is set up and the doctor-nurse team arrive at the bedside, home or hospital. They do make house calls, An IV is inserted, and then the patient has to give one final consent, and then the medication's injected. Often, family and friends are present, and the procedure and death take only a few minutes. My husband volunteers for Dying with Dignity as an independent witness for made requests because a lot of people have no one to ask. In order to prevent conflict of interest situations or exploitation, the law requires that anyone benefiting from the patient's estate cannot witness their request. And most healthcare facilities don't allow their staff to witness requests either. This leaves some patients with no family they can ask, and they may not want to involve friends. So, Dying with Dignity provides volunteers who go meet the patients, talk to them for a few minutes to make sure they're coherent and know what they're asking, check their ID, and witness their form. So far, my husband has witnessed over 30 of these requests. So he's talked to quite a few people, and he says almost all are very upbeat and happy to have the option and a sense of control over their situation. Check out the Dying with Dignity Canada website for lots of first-person stories and news articles about MAID in Canada. And the website is dyingwithdignity.ca. Dorothy, thank you so much for an important perspective, something we could learn a lot from in the United States, that's for sure. On the switchboard I've been going up by initials. Do I go by A, or would you like me to use your first name? What would you prefer?
Andrea's fine. I'm good. First name.
Okay, Andrea. Talk to me on this subject of suicide. What's your perspective? What would you like to bring to the table today?
My personal experience with suicide in the church has to do with when I was very active in my youth group. It's a Southern Baptist youth group in the Tampa Bay area. I can remember as early as age 12 being in the youth group and having the youth pastor, when everybody was praying, ask, okay, everybody's eyes are closed, don't look around, one of those warnings. Who here has ever thought of suicide, of ending their life? And I had those feelings. I had just recently moved from a different state into the area, and I was quite depressed at age 12, and I had those thoughts early on. And nothing happened. Nobody came up to me to show any concern, nothing at all. And for several years, I was active in the church all the way up until I was about 16, 17. And multiple times, youth group, the youth pastor, whether it was on a Wednesday night youth group or Sunday morning, Sunday school, or camp, into summer camp. So that was a thing too. Multiple times that would occur.
Well, I'm still stuck on the first encounter. We've all been, many of us have been through those altar calls. Every head bowed, every eye closed, no one looking around, right? I get it.
Yeah.
But the end game for you raising your hand was what? I would think no counselors came. They didn't bring you to the altar. They just said, okay, hey, thanks for that. I see that hand. And that was it?
Yeah. Well, you get the pep talk of, it's okay, Jesus loves you. And that should have, I guess, got the thought out of my head. Apparently,
that's like the religious equivalent of a pat on the head. Like, okay, there you go. Here's a little Jesus for you from long distance,
right?
And we're sure we'll pray for you.
Right. Well, I don't even know if it got to that much. It's more like, okay, think your way out of this based on Jesus loves you. That's supposed to be like, okay, we good, that kind of thing.
So you found the church very ham-handed when it came to the issues of mental health and dealing with things like depression, suicide, confusion about life, etc.
Yes, absolutely. In hindsight, of course, now that I understand what was going on, it's something that I find irresponsible. This went on over the years, and I later on in my adulthood was diagnosed with bipolar II disorder. I've had suicidal thoughts since for as long as I can remember, nearly on a daily basis, at least passively. So the multiple times that this question was asked over the course of my involvement in the church, and I raised my hand every time, not one adult reached out to me individually to talk to me. Not one. If someone were to have done that, instead of just saying Jesus loves you or don't do it or you're going to burn in hell, which also contradicts basically, oh, you're saved, you're good. That's another story. So it was just something that I recognized that had someone reached out to me, I may have been diagnosed in my teens with bipolar disorder rather than when I was in my 30s. Another part of the story that has to do with me attempting suicide in my teens, and again, no one reached out.
When you tell me today, Andrea, that you have the thought at least once a day,
yeah,
my natural response is, of course, one of concern. Is there a safety net around you? Is there community? Do you have resources?
Yes. My family understands that I have a mental illness, and I am hyper aware and deal with it through behavioral modification.
It's not like I'm going to walk into trap. I'm going to actively then engineer my own end. It's more abstract than that for you.
Exactly. And almost nihilistic. And that's just where my brain goes. And it's been that way for as long as I can remember.
You're a secular person. Do you ever have the thoughts that, this life is finite and the universe doesn't care if I exist? Does any of that stuff happen for you, or is it different than that?
Oh, no, there's an absolute rationalist perspective behind it for sure. I don't feel like there's a purpose, it just is, and I accept it. I don't have any sort of explanation as to why any of us keep going, but it just is. And I'm laughing because it's an uncomfortable subject for anybody. And I talk frankly about it just because those thoughts have always been there.
Do you deal with the concepts of like self-generated purpose? We as people who don't believe in heaven, hell, or nirvana, reincarnation, we can still have purpose. We just, as Dan Barker would say, it's life-driven purpose, right? Do you go down that road, or is it just sort of the moment-by-moment speed bumps that you deal with?
That second one, it really is just I kind of just keep busy to keep going because, oh my gosh, shit's fucked up hospital in this world,
I understand the feeling of despair when you look at the chaos in this world, for sure. Yeah. I just want to feel like you're getting some of the good stuff. Do you have some good stuff going on in your life?
Yeah, I have to consciously engage in activities that bring me any semblance of joy at all. And that helps. But it's not like, oh, I feel like there's a life purpose, that kind of verbiage or that kind of thought. It's just, okay, this brings me joy. And like you said, that moment by moment going over the bumps, but being mindful and consciously engaging in activities that actually bring me happiness and satisfaction and gratification until I am no more.
Well, Andrea, I hope you know you've always got people here. You've got me, and you've got the Thinking Atheist community. And thanks so much for being a part of the conversation today.
Thanks for including me, Seth.
Dan Barker, the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation and former pastor, like former evangelical, he put out a book 3 years ago called Life-Driven Purpose, How an Atheist Finds Meaning. This was sort of a play on Pastor Rick Warren's 30 million plus selling book called Purpose Driven Life, which was essentially declaring that you have to have God in your life, his God specifically, to have any sense of meaning, purpose, and goodness. And Dan kind of wanted to expose that and turn it on its ear. From page 27 of the book, let me read just a couple of paragraphs that might encourage you in the context of my phone call with Andrea. He said, "Here is the good news we atheists offer to the world. There is no purpose of life. It may sound counterintuitive, but that's truly great news. Life is its own reward. You should not want there to be a purpose of life. You are not a subject. You don't have an assignment to live up to. You don't have a cosmic task to accomplish. You don't have a duty to fulfill. You're not being managed or judged by an overlord. Unshackled from the chains of a master, you are truly free to live. Since life is its own reward, it can't have any purpose above and beyond itself. Of course, life is survival and reproduction, but that's a definition of life, not a purpose of life. If there is a God, what is the purpose of his life? Does he sit up in heaven looking around asking, why am I here? Now, here is the point on which this whole book hinges. To say there is no purpose of life is not to say there is no purpose in life. Life has immense purpose. not from outside, but from inside. Look what a huge difference a tiny preposition makes. Purpose of life versus purpose in life. Your life has purpose because it's endowed not by someone else's mind, but by your own. One is bondage, the other is liberty. So if there is no purpose of life, but there is purpose in life, then where does it come from? How do you find a life-driven purpose? You don't find it. In most cases, it finds you. You create it yourself by your intention to keep living your life as fully as possible, overcoming any obstacles in your way. Since your life is in many ways different from everyone else's, those obstacles and challenges will not be exactly the same for you as for the rest of the world. Purpose comes from solving problems. You don't look for an intention before you know what you want or need to do. You can't answer a question before it's asked. It's only after you identify a lack or desire or value or goal that you head for it. The heading for is the purpose, the intention in action. I think it's the very struggle to solve problems that makes life what it is. It makes life exciting. Life is not driven by purpose. Purpose is driven by life. You don't have a purpose-driven life. You have a life-driven purpose. If you are still religious and are still struggling with what it all means, then here is a purpose. Get rid of the problem. Start a slave rebellion. Depose the dictator. Live your own life. Dan's got another great quote on the subject. He said, asking, if there is no God, what is the purpose of life? Is like asking, if there is no master, whose slave shall I be? Thanks to Dan Barker for all of his great work. Just a tremendous guy. I have someone on the switchboard going by the initial R, and it's so good to have you on the show. Thanks for being here. How are you?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm well. I'd like to talk to you about a very serious subject and your perspective on suicide.
Well, in terms of the ethics of it, I think that a person's life definitely belongs to themselves. They should be able to decide at what point they're no longer getting the value out of their life that they wanted. But of course, there are complicated pieces to that where, it can really hurt the people around them and leave a lot of questions.
Well, let me start here. Were you raised with any teachings about suicide?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the perspective of my family wasn't so much, it was kind of, we can't really know for sure, that sort of thing. It was like kind of we don't really know, but you don't want to take the chance.
We don't know what? That you'll go to hell or that there's an afterlife or what?
That there is a hell, but we don't know if suicide sends you to hell. It
was better safe than sorry, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was sort of seen as, the coward's way out. That was kind of the repeated phrase that, rather than acknowledging the pain and the actual issues going on, it was just, oh, that's just the coward's way out. Just suck it up and deal with life,
Yeah, I've heard that one too. Did you ever experience suicidal thoughts in your own life?
Yeah. When I was a kid, especially, and then later on in my teens. In my teens, it was mostly connected with my search for truth, search for God. And in childhood, it was, a mix of things. I really got close and, my dad, I tried to express it to my dad and, his response was just, you will not do that. Just repeating over and over, you will not do that. I couldn't even tell, is he telling me not to do it? Is he predicting that I won't do it? What is he even trying to say? It was so weird. He wasn't even acknowledging what I was trying to tell him. It was just this mantra he kept repeating. It was really weird.
How old were you?
I think I was 12 at that point.
Did he take you seriously, you think, or no?
I don't think so. I don't know. It could have been one of those moments where, as a kid, you think your parents not taking you seriously, but they're really trying to hide their fear, or it could have been that he just really didn't believe me. It was hard to tell.
Did you really want to kill yourself?
I felt desperate to get out of the life that I was living, and I didn't know any other way. I was afraid of the process of dying, but I was more afraid of the process of living. And at night I would just be lying awake, just waiting for people to fall asleep. But then I would fall asleep, and I don't know. Oddly enough, just the simple act of falling asleep kept me alive for another day. Other times it was not as serious, but I just didn't know what to do. I'd just be sitting in kind of a daze, just trying to figure it out, what else can I possibly do to escape this? I don't know what to do.
Do you believe in heaven or hell today?
No, I don't. Well, the program's still running in the back of my mind, because that's what I was raised with, but it's like a faulty program and it's turning into more of a virus, but I'm starting to.
Yeah, it's not a feature, it's a bug. Yeah, I get that.
Mm-hmm. It gets reignited when I get into, tense conversations with the family about it, and they're almost gleeful sometimes, and other times they're teary. It's really weird. It's like this game of emotional manipulation, but they definitely believe that I'm going to hell. So it gets reignited, but yeah, I don't believe in heaven or hell. And it was really hard to let go of the concept of heaven, but yeah.
The hard drive analogy is such a good one. I'm so glad you used it. It's a great way of, even though in some ways we are sort of pattern-seeking machines and our brains are wired that way, we look at religion as a program that many parents and cultures will install on a child's mental hard drive. And then they don't tell them that there's an uninstall option or that another program runs better. We just think that's all we have, right? And for us, then it becomes the process of going through science, reason, and the evidence, overcoming the emotions to realize that, yes, we can uninstall these bad ideas and we can then embrace a better program, a better method for determining what is true. It's such a good analogy. Thanks for using that. How you doing these days? Okay?
Mostly. Some days are worse than others, but I'm starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. It's just kind of a one day at a time process.
Is it weird? Do you call yourself an atheist? Are you still searching? What?
I do, but I rarely use that word to my family, and I haven't, come out to my extended family yet, so that's going to be quite a wild ride.
Yeah, on your terms, take your time. It sounds like you've been through plenty, and some people punish themselves because they're not, shouting it in front of everybody at Thanksgiving dinner. Don't do that to yourself, okay? It'll come, it'll happen, but make sure that it's on your timing and on your terms, and don't feel like you have to rush it. But the interesting part is now that you don't believe in heaven or hell, and you're not sort of the appointed, adopted child of a divine wizard and all that stuff, now you actually are doing better than you were when you were religious?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a funny sort of way I am. It is hard. There is a grieving process, letting go of those sorts of things, because they're a major source of hope. But on the other hand, they kind of devalue this life in a way. And now that this life is all I can count on, I really want to make the most of it, because I'm going to have eternity to, be essentially asleep, to not experience anything. So every breath, every moment, every sight and sound and everything that I take in, that's something special, because that's something I'm not going to be experiencing anymore through eternity. And it becomes so much more valuable to me, even sometimes the unpleasant things, because at least I'm experiencing something,
I'm a professional communicator, and I just want you to know that I couldn't have phrased that as well as you did. That is just like, I want to make that the soundbite which promotes the show. What a wonderful way of looking at this temporary life. It's every moment being precious, and even when bad shit hits us, we're alive, we're here to breathe the air and do all that stuff. Whatever you said, I just want to, everybody make a transcript of that. And if you need some encouragement, she will encourage. You have encouraged some people today, so take that for what it's worth, okay?
I'm really happy about that. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your perspective. And I am hoping for good things for you in the days and years ahead, and you are greatly appreciated, okay?
Thanks. You too.
Joining me for the next segment of this conversation is Dr. Steven Davidson. He is a psychotherapist. He is a mental health professional who can speak with some authority about the subject of suicide, the things from his experience and education that perhaps influence suicide. And so rather than try to elaborate more, I'll just bring Dr. Davidson right in. It's good to have you. Thanks for joining me, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Seth. I appreciate being on your show.
Dr. Davidson, this is a minefield. It's something that I want to approach respectfully, but at the same time, we want to be able to speak with some detail about the very difficult subject of suicide. So in your practice, you have met people, you've treated people, you've encountered people who have attempted or thought about or even carried this through?
Yes, that's true. Over the last 30 years, I've worked with many people who had suicidal thoughts, and some of my patients did indeed follow through with suicide.
How do you handle that as a psychotherapist, someone who's treating someone, and then they just decide to pull the plug? What does that do to you?
Well, it's difficult to deal with. Therapists often perceive that we have failed in some way. We question what more we could have done. Sometimes you can see that it's coming because someone has made multiple attempts. They have a lifelong history of very severe mental illness that's not responding to medication or different kinds of psychotherapy interventions. There may be multiple hospitalizations. And there are those people who have chronic mental illness that at some point follow through. And it's uncomfortable to work with those people because it might feel like it is looming out there. As therapists, we want to help everyone that we can. We don't want people to see this as an option. But there are those cases where it's just not preventable.
This is kind of a moving target. People who walk into your office come from so many different backgrounds, personalities. There's so many gears in the machine, so many factors to consider. There's no magic sort of catch-all solution, is there?
No, there isn't. And there are some people who chronically have suicidal thoughts, but they are able to manage them. There are other people who never speak of having suicidal thoughts, and then one day they take their life, and no one saw it coming. And there are certain ways that we assess for risk of suicide, but there are also those people who fly under the radar, and everyone around them, their family, if their therapist, if they had a therapist, their coworkers are surprised, shocked, did not see that this was a possibility for this person.
I was speaking earlier in our broadcast to Courtney, who was speaking about how suicide, for a great many people, they seem to think it is, well, someone's just mentally ill, or, there's something else going on, they're broken in some way. But from her perspective, is someone coming to a moment where the idea of ending their life is more attractive than living with the pain that they must endure every moment of every day. Can we speak to suicide from the perspective of pain?
Well, I think that's a good description of why people may choose suicide. They feel like it is their best option. And there are many people I've worked with who have attempted suicide, and after the fact, they say that they're glad that they didn't die. And in retrospect, they didn't really want to die. They just wanted relief from the pain they were experiencing, and they couldn't find any other way to get relief.
Is there always the answer, though, from a mental health professional perspective, that we can end the pain, or there's a way through the pain? I mean, is it possible that you may not have the answer? I can't take away your pain. I can't guarantee you that this is going to get any better. Can you speak to that at all?
Mostly with mental illness, it is treatable. There are things that we can do to help people feel better and to not be chronically suicidal. But pain is part of the human experience, and sometimes pain is reasonable in life. Emotional pain is reasonable. So we want to try to help people tolerate that reasonable emotional pain, such as grief, for example. That can become complicated, that can move into a depression. It's reasonable that someone has that response when they've lost someone in their life that they're close to. So we want to teach people the skills to cope with life when it is painful. But there are people who have very serious chronic mental illnesses where there are not good options available to them. The medications may help a little bit, but they have horrible side effects. They may have a very poor quality of life because of the mental illness that they have. And we do the best we can with the resources we have, with the science that we have, with the interventions that we have. But there are some people who are so severely mentally ill that there's not a lot of relief that we can give them.
Let's talk about the pain, physical pain. Someone's in chronic physical pain and there have been no solutions for them. They can find no way through. Do you think that those people, perhaps this is more of a philosophical question, you can avoid it if you want. I know you have a practice to conduct, but I mean, in your mind, do they have a right to decide, I'm done?
Well, I think that you do have to look at the circumstances, and people with terminal illnesses, people who are in severe pain, there is no hope of them getting better. With those cases, we can understand it more. We can make more sense of it when it's physician-assisted suicide, or it's an action that someone takes because they have a terminal illness that is getting progressively worse. And so it's easier for us to look at those circumstances and make sense of it because we understand why. We understand that that person's pain had become unbearable and it was not going to get better, or their quality of life was not going to improve and it was continuing to deteriorate. That's a little different from someone who takes their life and we can't make sense of it. We don't see any clear indicators about why they made that choice. And when we look at their circumstances, we can see a lot of other options that they had available to them that we think they didn't consider or didn't know about.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to the end of life issue. But first, and I hesitate, this question, I don't want it to ever be construed that I am trying to minimize someone who has attempted to take their own life. But I want to speak about the quote-unquote cry for help. The person who puts a shotgun to their head may be in a different category than someone who is attempting to take their own life, or appears to be in a way that is more discoverable, is seen, more visible by those around them, and could be and might be construed as a cry for help. Notice me, notice my pain, hear that I'm this desperate, reach out to me. At my core, I really don't want to die. Have you dealt with any of that? Do you have any thoughts about the cry for help?
Well, again, it's part of our training as therapists to always respond to that cry for help. And for some people, that action, that gesture is how they ask for help. It is how they let people know that they are in distress. So we always want to treat it seriously. We always want to respond to it. We distinguish between suicidal ideations, which are just thoughts about suicide with no intent to act on it. A suicidal gesture is when someone does actually make an attempt, or they start preparing, planning their suicide. They buy a gun, they stockpile medication, they do some things that are an action toward following through. And most suicide attempts are not completed. There are lots of people who make attempts and they don't complete for whatever reason. But we always want to respond to those attempts seriously, because it is a request for help, and we need to respond to that before that person moves further into making more serious gestures and completion.
We were looking at some statistics that a tremendous number of people, perhaps more than many expect, have had at some time entertained the idea, what if I might one day have thought about suicide in their own lives? Has that been your experience? I mean, it's not just a fringe, but the human condition. This is a common thought.
I think it is, and it might be innate, because it is the ultimate way for us to get out of a painful situation. And there are some experiences in life that are horrific, emotionally and physically. And to know that there is one way to exit is a source of relief for some people. So most people will tell you that they have given it a thought, not a serious thought, not that they are planning it, but they have considered, what would it be like if I died by suicide? Or when we hear of someone else who has completed suicide, we try to make sense of it by running it through our own filters and our own thoughts about how we deal with life and how we deal with emotional crisis.
Back to the end-of-life issues, do you think that physicians should be involved? One of the arguments I hear about those who are terminally ill is that, don't taint the medical profession. Don't bring healers in to give life-ending medications or processes to people. You shouldn't cross those streams, so to speak. I don't know that I agree. Do you have an opinion?
Well, I do think that there should be options for physician-assisted suicide for people who are terminally ill or have chronic debilitating illnesses where there's just no way to give them relief. And, hospice does not provide assisted suicide, but they do come in at that final stage of life knowing that their purpose is to help that person die because they're in a terminal situation and it's not going to improve.
Does religion ever get in the way? Somebody comes in and they're like, well, I want to have this conversation about my own mental health, but I'm full of sin. And I'm a screw up. I was born corrupt. I deserve this. I don't deserve happiness because this holy book, church dogma, religious person, parent, whatever, has instructed me my whole life as such. Does that come up and how do you deal with it?
Well, for some people, their faith is the reason that they don't attempt suicide. And that's absolutely fine because we don't want people to make suicide attempts. Those kinds of questions come up a lot for people when they've lost a friend or a loved one to suicide. Based on their religion, they may believe that that person cannot be forgiven. Some Christians refer to it as an unforgivable sin because once you take your own life, you're not there to ask for forgiveness. So I think religion is a huge factor that influences how people process another person's suicide, maybe how they think about their own circumstances and if they would take their life themselves. But I hear it more with people trying to understand the suicide of other people and their concern about what has happened to their soul now, that they have taken this act, which many religions consider an act against God. There are some religions that if you take your life for God, then it's celebrated. And there's a belief that you're going to have extra rewards in an afterlife because of that.
The title of the broadcast is A Secular Perspective on Suicide. Can we speak to suicide from a quote-unquote secular perspective? What are your thoughts?
Well, secular people in general see death as final, whether it's death from natural causes or from an accident or from suicide. So there's not a belief in an afterlife. Secular people are not going to have questions about, is this person in heaven or hell? Secular people generally don't believe in reincarnation, that this person's going to come back as a flower or another person or an animal. But secular people, like religious people, are not immune to grief. And so they're going to go through the same grief process. They're going to experience anger and sadness, confusion, just like a religious person would. So, secular people might make some sense of it because secular people tend to be very engaged in empathy, in social causes. They might not process it in the same way that a religious person does, but if it's someone that's really close to them, they're still going to experience grief and some of those feelings of guilt and question why. Even if there is a suicide note left, those notes don't answer all the questions.
Religious or secular, we're still talking about the human condition, right?
Right. And, secular people are also moral people and ethical people. And so they're going to approach this subject from a place of morality and ethics and have some similar emotional responses, but they're not going to wonder about this person's soul in an afterlife. They're not going to have the same kinds of concerns or worries that a religious person may have.
My final moments with Dr. Steven Davidson. If I was on sort of your couch or in the chair or whatever, we were having a consultation, and you can bill me, okay? But, let's say that let's emulate, let's do a little role play. I mean, if I was coming to you and I was just bogged down in my life and my heart and my mind with tremendous anguish, pain. I got no joy out of being alive. I was just punching the clock every single day, thinking, death is better than this. And I was to have a conversation with you. What would be the flavor of that conversation? What would you say to somebody listening in this audience who's going through that very thing?
Well, what I would do with you in that moment, if I didn't already know you well, I would talk to you about your resources in life, your sense of community, who you had in your life, family, friends, pets, neighbors, who was available to you who could assist you in getting through this challenge.
Are you saying then that isolation is a contributing factor in many cases?
Yes, it is. It's a big factor in why people take their life. One of the populations with a high risk of completed suicide are men, single men, over the age of 65. And it's because as men, we don't do a good job of maintaining social networks. We don't have a strong sense of community in the way that women do. We have a hard time asking for help. We have a do-it-ourself mindset. And so many senior men find themselves alone because maybe a spouse has died, or maybe they are divorced or single, and they don't have close relationships with friends or other family members, and they live in isolation. And there's no one around to say, hey, let's go out, let's go get something to eat, let's go to a movie, or to talk with them, to help them find purpose in day-to-day living. It's why pets are so useful for seniors. Just having another living creature there with you gives you some sense of purpose and helps you to not feel as alone and isolated. So I would start with that. I would start by talking about community, and then, I would want to talk to you about your vision for what it would be like if you didn't feel this emotional pain. Can you even visualize being on the other side of it? And if you were on the other side of it, then what would you do? If I have someone that I'm very seriously concerned about, then I will refer them to a psychiatrist for medication evaluation, or even talk to them about hospitalization on a short-term basis.
Seems like a vicious cycle. The more down and in pain you are, the more you withdraw. And the more you withdraw and isolate yourself, in many cases, the more down and in pain you are.
Yes, but if you already have a strong sense of community, people around you are noticing that you are withdrawing. And they are becoming alarmed, and they are taking actions to try to turn that around for you. It's those people who are isolated and there's no one checking on them or calling them or living with them that really have the greater risk.
We talk about warning signs. Did you see any warning signs? And I realize that by asking the question, I don't mean to put the onus on anyone around someone who has taken their life and say, well, why didn't you see something? Should you have seen something? Meaning the burden was upon them. Quite frankly, we need to do a better job, perhaps, of removing the feeling of guilt and shame and I should have done more. I should have seen this coming from those who are in the periphery of a suicide. Do you want to speak to that at all? I mean, there are parents, families, friends, coworkers who think, if I should have known, and then they blame themselves in many ways.
Well, as a therapist, there are warning signs that I look for, but sometimes we don't see the warning signs, or sometimes there are no warning signs. Things that we would look for are a drastic change in behavior, someone beginning to give their things away, someone withdrawing socially, a big change in mood and behavior. Those are some of the warning signs that we look for. And, other changes like things that were once important to them, they're not really important to them anymore. They're not showing up for social activities anymore. But there are certainly those circumstances where we don't see warning signs. I had a personal friend who was also working in the field of mental health who took his own life a year ago. And he had had depression for a lot of his life, But what he was telling me and his friends more recently is that he was doing well, that he felt good, that he felt more hopeful than he had in a long time. He was making plans to do things. He had a plan to go to a concert with me 2 days after his suicide. So that's an example of how it's not on the radar. We have someone who says they feel good. You look at their behavior indicates that they're doing well, that they're happy, they're making plans to do things in the future. All of those are signs that people are doing well. And in this particular case, this man had been planning it for a few months. And, there was no steady decline in mood. People were not seeing him withdraw. If anything, he was saying, I feel better. I want to be more socially active. So we can't always see it. There are those people who they take their life and people around them feel guilty and they wonder, how could I have missed this? But mental health professionals miss it. People who are trained to look for it miss it. This is a man who worked in the field of mental health and who had lots of close friends who were therapists who missed it.
Dr. Steven Davidson, is there a resource? I like to ask, many of my guests, is there a resource you'd recommend? Someone wanted to take the next step if they knew someone or perhaps in their own lives experienced the thoughts of suicide or were dealing with suicide? Where would you send them?
Well, you can always just call 911. If you are having thoughts about acting on it, you can call 911. Most first responders are trained to deal with people who have suicidal thoughts.
Really? I mean, I always thought it would be like the National Suicide Hotline, but you're saying that that's a form of emergency that they are trained largely to deal with?
Yes, and you can call the National Suicide Hotline. It's there as a resource also, but first responders are trained in certainly most metropolitan cities because they work very closely with mental health professionals and emergency rooms, are trained to show up and take what actions they need to move that person to a place of safety quickly. Call your mental health center, the Department of Mental Health in your community. You can go to your physician. Many people start with their primary care physician when they are experiencing depression or anxiety or beginning to have suicidal thoughts. There are lots of resources out there. It's just making that initial call.
Dr. Steven Davidson, I appreciate your expertise and your time on this broadcast so very much. And we will again link those resources in the description box of the show. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you, Seth.
Thank you so much to everyone for participating, for their submissions. I'm so sorry I couldn't get to nearly all that were submitted, but know that they are appreciated and your story is important. And it's my hope that this broadcast will have provided encouragement and perhaps some valuable resources to someone out there as we approach the subject of suicide from a secular perspective. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.